the biogeography, ecology, and biology of Humboldtia laurifolia, an endemic plant named after Humboldt. And so it's a unique myrmecophyte which is endemic to Sri Lanka. And its global distribution of Humboldtia, it's a South Asian species, genus rather. It has 6 species accepted so far, and 3 are doubtful species according to this global database. And we have Humboldtia, several species, Wailiana, Unichuga, Decorans, and Brunonis. They are all Indian species. And we have Humboldtia laurifolia, which was mentioned earlier in Sri Lanka, which is endemic. And some of you may have seen the tree when we had this tour in the morning in the gardens. That's a tree which was planted over 200 years, at least 150 to 200 years ago. Right. And Humboldtia laurifolia is internationally, globally considered as a vulnerable species, but in Sri Lanka it is reasonably widespread, and therefore in the national threatened status it is considered as least concern at present. But I think with the changes that are happening, it may go into one of the threatened status, although it is least concerned at the moment. And it's used as an ornamental plant in wildlife gardening and medicinal values. I think this will be spoken in length at a subsequent presentation. And the tree in the garden is on your left-hand side, and that's a very old tree. You can see the stems. And the name Humboldtia came later, and this again will be elaborated further later. But originally it was called Backshire laurifolia, and it is an incorrect name and corrected later. So that will be done later in the presentation, explanations on this. So that's from the global distribution. It's a South Asian species, and in Sri Lanka, it's distributed in the southwestern part, which is the aseasonal part of the country, low country as well as the mountains, but it's more prevalent in the low country southwest. And these are the biogeographic regions of the country, and the phytogeographic regions to be more precise. And as you can see, it's more in the southwestern aseasonal lowlands and lower mountain forests, and moving into the intermediate, that is ecotone region, a little bit there. But unfortunately, the southwestern part where this species is prevalent, the forest cover is rather poor, and it's fragmented, and small forest patches are found compared to the rest of the country. So therefore, it's a threatened status, although it is least concerned at present. I think it will later into a state.
By having people that sit on in the RPA space and centres, they can also bring to the table and their groups opportunities that some members may or may not be involved in.
Spatial distribution in, sorry about that interruption. Coming back to its distribution in small scale in a 25-hectare forest dynamics plot in Singharaja, a seasonal rainforest here. And this species shows a very strong habitat species association. As you can see on the extreme right diagram, the black dots, which are concentrated on the higher altitude, higher elevational spurs in this diagram, which is about 150 meters from the base to the top. Not much of elevational or altitudinal difference, but even within that, you see a strong association with high elevation spur areas, as you can see, yes. Whereas other species are distributed elsewhere. For example, we have selected another species Humboldtia castanifolia of Dilleniaceae, another endemic genus, in fact, and one of the species. It is in the valleys, as you can see in the diagram. Thanks. Right, as I said, there are other species like Humboldtia and Humboldtia, which are showing very strong habitat association, which is very much, I would say, unique to Sri Lanka forests, because more than 50% of the tree species that we sampled in our plot, that is 60 species or more in the plot, show strong habitat association. There are, of course, others who don't show that, but majority of them show this strong habitat association, which you can see in the two diagrams below. So Humboldtia laurifolia is the most dense species in the plot, with 11% of the total stems out of 205,373 total number of stems in the plot. Right, coming on to the mortality, recruitment, and the turnover that we have studied during different census intervals, starting from about 1996 up to 2010. We had done 3 census interval recordings here, and you can see the mortality was in the blue gives the first census interval, 1996 to 2000, and the red one is 2001 to 2005, and 2006 to 2010 in greenish yellow. And as you can see, recruitment is much greater than mortality in all 3 intervals, and the turnover rate is accordingly higher. But in general, it is considered that the mortality, recruitment, and turnover rates decline with increase in census intervals. That is a general observation, although. But since these are stand dynamic rates, which are taken in short intervals of 5 years, they are highly variable over these time scales, and also in small spatial scales, as you can see here. So there's a deviation from the general findings, because these are shorter intervals and a small area that we have sampled, 25 hectares. Coming on to the most important part, that is the biology of Humboldtia laurifolia. It's an endemic myrmecophyte, as I said earlier. It is locally gregarious, as you saw earlier, again in the slide of the plot. And it's understory tree in moist forest in general, that is seasonal forest as well as partially seasonal forest. And with leaf flush producing about 4 to 6 internode units in a succession. So at every time you get 4 to 6 leaf internodes. The base of the internode, here, base of the internode is narrow and solid, but it's the upper part is inflated with the large hollow cavity by deterioration of the central pith region. So these internodal domatia and the food supplies in extrafloral nectaries represent a magnet, according to some researchers, for a myriad of invertebrate associates, ranging from mutualistic ants, wasps, bees, pseudoscorpions, spiders, and also arboreal annelids. Right. So resident ants dominated by 80% of the ants dominated by this particular species, Technomyrmex albipes, and they occupy hollow stem internodes. They feed on nectaries on young pinnately compound leaves, which you can see in circles. Nectaries. This food supply is temporarily active only on the young stem internodes, young leaves, also in flower buds and tissues, and organs that are mostly susceptible to herbivory. So those are found in young regions of the plant. Therefore, it's called a movable feast because this, as the plant grows, the young areas, the parts of the tree moves and therefore these nectaries and other food supplies, they also move further up. So those the invertebrate populations. The insect in turn, it's a mutualistic, produce a protection from herbivory to the leaf flush and the developing inflorescence of the host plant. Right. Another observation made by this group, Cromber and others, they did detailed study on this. They observed the trees in forest understory as well as trees in open sunlight. They found that the trees in the forest understory had 40%, only 40% swollen internodes, and there was a moderate abundance of ants in them. And the leaf damage is about 50% or greater. Whereas the trees in the open sunlight near streams and roadsides, they have more than 90% of the stems, young stems, are swollen and with internodes, and greater ant abundance is found in them. As such, little herbivore damage was observed in them. So there are two habitats having different kind of patterns of the internode systems, which is interesting, and we should work more on that as to see why it is. So these are some of the insects and that you find. Technomyrmex avipes, top diagram, red weaver ant, which you can see on the young flush as well. There, yes. And the pollinators also have been studied in Indian species, but not so much in Sri Lankan species, but they found to be bees and butterflies are the pollinators. Right. So these are different species, and there's much time. I'm not going to go into the details. These are different species of invertebrates that you find in them. Then the seed dormancy also has been studied in Humboldtia laurifolia in Sri Lanka, and they have recalcitrant seeds, and they are reported to have a novel kind of epicotyle dormancy. For sebaceous legumes, it's something new. It's seed germination following the emergence, that is the second diagram, that is yes, and radical is emerging at that stage. That's about 18 days after germination start, and its radical develops further, and the pleomule and the epicotyle starts moving or germinating and coming up after about 20 days, as you can see. So therefore, there's a delay in the radical initiation and the epicotyle and the plumule emergence. So this dormancy strategy may account to its success as the dominant habitat specialist by recruiting the largest population of seedlings. And in this habitat, the desiccation during short dry spells is not uncommon. Therefore, it could be a strategy to overcome these climatic changes that you, or the weather changes that you observe in the rainforest. Then rhizobiology of Humboldtia laurifolia also has been studied, and root nodules with several distinct rhizobial strains have been isolated from this species, and they have found to have varying levels of infectivity, ranging from 50 to 100% nodulation upon reinfection, and efficiency in nitrogen fixation as determined by acetylene reduction assay. Right. So coming to the summary of it, it's a gregarious understory tree in moist forests with strong habitat affinities. It's a legume with root nodules and seed with a novel method of epicotyle dormancy for that family, and represents a magnet for a myriad of invertebrate associates, ranging from mutualistic invertebrate species and so on. The numbers are given there. I think in the next slide, it's, yeah. There are 14 antaxa species of different wasps, bees, predating flies, pseudoscorpion spiders, and annelid, belonging to the Peradeniya genus. And they provide nesting, this species provides nesting sites in soil and internal information, as we saw earlier, sugary secretions in extrafloral nectaries, which is called a movable feast, and pollen also for brood feeding of some of the invertebrates. In return, ant species nesting in the plant protects the young foliage and flower buds herbivory. Finally, the Alexander von Humboldt, in addition to being a great scientist and indefatigable explorer, was a magnet as an authoritative and eloquent speaker during his time. He was invited to many fora in Europe and Americas. As such, it's a great tribute to name this Sri Lankan myrmecophyte, in its own right a magnet for an array of invertebrates, as you saw in this presentation, as Humboldtia laurifolia by Wahl, in recognition of his contribution to science. So it's upon us now to conduct phylogeographic studies on Humboldtia species, together with that of their co-adapted invertebrate fauna, which will be a significant contribution in commemorating the pioneer biogeographer Alexander Humboldt in our times. Thank you very much, and thanks for joining us for this International Humboldt Day in Sri Lanka, and more events and videos at this